For the last 9 episodes, we have been walking through the fires of the 18th and 19th centuries. We have watched empires rise and fall. We have watched philosophers draft economic blueprints that changed the fate of millions. We have seen the birth of the factory, the railroad, the public school, and the terrifying efficiency of the colonial machine. But as we arrive at the end of this mini-series, we have to pull the camera all the way back. We have to look at the entire 300-year tapestry we've just woven. Because the genesis of modern economic development is not a single, clean narrative. It is not a straight line from the invention of the steam engine to the modern smartphone. It is a messy, violent, and deeply contingent evolution of ideas, institutions, and statecraft. Today we are looking at the groundwork for modern development. We are going to tie all of the threads together, from the early mercantilist kings trying to fund their navies to the explosive 19th century intellectual reckonings that birthed the 20th century. And we are going to see how the modern, highly mathematical field of development economics isn't actually new at all. It is simply the academic rediscovery of the exact same highly practical lessons that the architects of the 19th century learned the hard way. I'm your host, Devin Hillsdon-Smith, and you're listening to Site Selectors Are People 2. This is the finale of The Architects of Prosperity, Episode 10, The Groundwork for Modern Development. Let's get into it. Welcome back. Before we wrap up our grand tour of global economic history, a quick word from today's sponsor, Hyphen Strategies. Seriously, folks, I hope you enjoy me self-promoting. I hate this part, but I'm trying to build it into where we're going to have sponsorships moving forward. You get it. So thanks for sticking with me. Here we go. Sponsorship. In economic development, it is easy to get distracted by the shiny objects. The massive tax incentives, the glossy marketing campaigns, the ribbon-cutting ceremonies. But as history proves, true prosperity is built on unglamorous, highly resilient institutions. Hyphen Strategies helps communities and corporate leaders stop chasing the ribbon cuttings and start building the structural foundations that actually sustain long-term growth. Whether you are analyzing supply chain vulnerabilities or building a custom workforce pipeline, you need a blueprint that survives the test of time. Visit www.hyphenstrategiesllc.com to learn more. All right, let's look at the whole board. The 300-year evolution of economic development did not begin with free market philosophers sitting in universities. It began as a highly practical, aggressive project of state building. In the 1600s and 1700s, the world was dominated by mercantilism. This was a system of absolute power. The goal of the national economy was not to make the average peasant wealthy. The goal was to forge a massive, unified national war chest to serve the glory of the state. We saw this with the British Navigation Acts, which used intense bureaucratic regulation to create a closed loop of imperial trade, starving the Dutch capital and building the Royal Navy. We saw this in France with Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the financial architect for King Louis XIV, who used the heavy top-down power of the state to build royal glass factories, subsidize domestic industries, and ban foreign imports. But this aggressive genesis of state building immediately created a massive, highly mechanical problem: unmanageable national debt. Wars and global empires are increasingly expensive. By the early 1700s, both Britain and France were drowning in debt. And how they chose to solve that debt sparked one of the most critical path-dependent divergences in economic history. In 1720, Both nations attempted massive, unprecedented experiments in financial engineering to securitize their state debt. We call them bubbles, but they were actually the birth of modern finance. In France, a Scottish gambler and economic theorist named John Law convinced the French regent to let him take over the national economy. Law created the Mississippi Company, if you recall, tying the French national debt to the completely unproven, wildly exaggerated potential of the swamps of Louisiana in the New World. He printed massive amounts of unbacked paper money to drive up the stock price. When the illusion shattered, the Mississippi bubble collapsed spectacularly. It destroyed the wealth of the French middle class, ruined public faith in paper currency, and critically destroyed French faith in their state's ability to manage its own finances. This political financial collapse paralyzed the French economy for decades and directly paved the way for the French Revolution. Britain, meanwhile, had its own crisis the exact same year, the South Sea Bubble. They also tried to securitize their naval debt through a monopoly trading company. And just like in France, the bubble popped, ruining thousands of investors. But the political reaction was entirely different. British Parliament stepped in, ruthlessly investigated the fraud, and absorbed the company's debt into the Bank of England, and created the Consul, a permanent, reliable, interest-paying government bond. This divergence is everything. France suffered political financial collapse. Britain achieved political financial consolidation. By proving they would always honor their debts, the British state gained the ability to borrow capital at incredibly low interest rates, funding the infrastructure in the Navy that would allow them to dominate the globe. The institution of the central bank proved to be the ultimate competitive advantage. We'll be right back. By the late 18th century, the heavy, state-directed system of mercantilism was facing a massive intellectual revolution. The era of classical economics had arrived. Thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo looked at the corruption of the mercantilist monopolies and argued for something radical, laissez-faire. They created the ideology of free trade, arguing that if the state just stepped back and let the invisible hand of the capital market, or of the market direct capital, everyone would be wealthier. Britain aggressively adopted this ideology, dropping its tariffs and preaching free trade around the world. But in practice, the British liberal model was a great contradiction. They preached laissez-faire, but the British state was incredibly active. It used its power to reluctantly regulate capital, passing the Factory Acts to stop children from being ground to death in textile looms, and simultaneously it enthusiastically used state power to discipline labor. In 1834, they passed the New Poor Law, essentially criminalizing poverty by forcing the destitute into horrific, prison-like workhouses. The state wasn't hands-off, it was actively engineering a compliant, desperate labor pool for its new factories. And when the rest of the world looked at the British winners model, they didn't see a blueprint to follow. They saw a ladder that the British were trying to pull up behind them. The evolution of global development violently split. The challenger nations explicitly rejected the British free trade gospel. The United States. Alex Hamilton drafted his report on manufacturers, designing a fierce nationalist system of high tariffs, state-sponsored corporate espionage, and federal infrastructure to protect young American factories. Germany. Frederick List championed the Zollverein, the customs union that dropped internal borders to build massive domestic scale, while raising external tariff walls to keep British goods out. In Japan, Following the shock of Commodore Perry's black ships, the samurai class executed the Meiji Restoration. They dismantled their own feudal systems to pioneer a ruthless, state-led model of catch-up industrialization, building state-owned foundries and shipyards before handing them over to private conglomerates. These nationalist models were not driven by the invisible hand. They were driven by the iron fist of state survival. But none of these grand strategies would have worked without two unglamorous, highly structural foundations provided by the enabling state. You can protect an infant industry with a tariff, but it will fail if it cannot ship its goods. So the state built the transportation matrix. The US federal government gave away millions of acres of land to subsidize private transcontinental railroads. And you cannot run a chemical plant if your workers cannot read the manual. So the state engineered the human mind. They built the public school movement, adopting the Prussian model of standardized testing and certified teachers to forge a disciplined, literate, highly compliant industrial workforce. We'll be right back. And we're back. So we can't celebrate the ingenuity of the 19th century enabling state without staring directly at the profound, horrifying fault line upon which it was built, the colonial model. The story of constructive national industrialization in Europe and America is inextricably linked to a global system of absolute anti-development. The colonial model was mercantilism stripped of any pretense of local benefit. It was a system explicitly designed for maximum resource extraction. The European powers conquered the global south and instituted highly mechanical, deeply extractive institutions designed to lock colonized economies into dependent relationships. They destroyed diverse, resilient local agriculture and forced the creation of cash crop economies, dedicating 80% of a colony's arable land to growing cotton, indigo, and tea for the metropole, sparking massive engineered famines. They built massive infrastructure projects, like the 40,000 miles of the Indian Railway, but they were not designed to integrate a domestic Indian market. They were high-speed funnels designed to vacuum raw materials out of the interior and prevent the formation of a competitive local industrial base. The development of the West and the structural underdevelopment of the rest were, and are, two sides of the exact same historical coin. And as the 19th century ended, the crushing poverty created by these internal contradictions, both the exploitation of the domestic working class and the violence of the imperial model, generated three massive intellectual reckonings. 1. The socialist critique. Karl Marx looked at the theft of surplus value and provided the intellectual framework for the working class revolution. His writings became the ideological blueprint for the communist model that would eventually govern half the globe. 2. The conservative solution. Otto von Bismarck, terrified of Marx's revolution, executed a brilliant act of political judo. He invented the modern welfare state, health insurance and pensions, using state power to bribe the working class into loyalty and ensure the German industrial machine had healthy workers. And 3, the liberal heresy. John A. Hobson looked at the British Empire and proved that imperialism was caused by massive domestic wealth inequality. The rich hoarded capital, the poor suffered from forced underconsumption, and the system had to violently expand overseas, justifying profitable investments. These three men didn't just write critiques, they wrote the DNA for the 20th century. Marx birthed Soviet communism. Bismarck birthed the European social market economy. and Hobson provided the exact economic diagnosis of underconsumption that John Maynard Keynes would later use to design the New Deal and save capitalism during the Great Depression. We'll be right back. So, how exactly did we get from Karl Marx writing in a Victorian library and the British Empire ruthlessly extracting cotton from India to you? How did we get to you, sitting in a windowless conference room in Ohio or South Carolina, looking at a tax abatement spreadsheet, trying to convince a Japanese auto manufacturer to build a $2 billion electric vehicle plant in your county? How did the grand, violent clash of empires shrink down into the modern, highly formalized profession of regional economic development? When our historical narrative leaves off at the dawn of the 20th century, the global board was completely set. The great industrial machines were built. But remember John A. Hobson's warning about imperialism? He warned that these massive industrialized nations, choking on their own inequality and desperate for new markets, were going to run out of territory to conquer. And he was right. The next 50 years were an absolute unmitigated bloodbath to determine which of these economic systems would actually survive. The pressure cooked until it exploded into 2 world wars. The great colonial empires shattered. And in between those wars, the global capitalist engine completely, catastrophically stalled out. The Great Depression pushed the free market to the absolute brink of total collapse. During that depression, the United States executed the ultimate, most dramatic manifestation of the enabling state in human history. They used the intellectual foundation of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that when the free market panics, when factory owners stop investing and consumers stop spending, the economy enters a death spiral. And the only entity large enough and powerful enough to break that death spiral is the federal government. The state must step in and become the spender of last resort. So, the United States launched the New Deal. They didn't just tweak interest rates or adjust tariff schedules. They poured millions of tons of concrete. They built the Hoover Dam. They created the Tennessee Valley Authority, laying thousands of miles of wire and electrifying massive, impoverished swaths of the rural South. They put millions of unemployed men on the federal payroll to build national parks and pave highways. They proved that massive, highly targeted government intervention could literally resurrect a dead economy. Then came 1945. The war ended. Europe and Japan were reduced to ash and rubble. The United States stood alone as the undisputed, untouched industrial superpower of the world. But the US government realized a terrifying economic truth. If Europe remained a smoldering ruin, the US would have nobody to buy its exports, and the American economy would immediately slide right back into a depression. Or worse, the starving European populations would voluntarily vote to join the Soviet Communist bloc. To prevent this, the United States launched the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was essentially Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers exported on a global scale. The U.S. pumped billions of dollars of state capital directly into Western Europe to rebuild their infrastructure, reconstruct their bombed-out factories, and stabilize their currencies. It was the most successful economic development megaproject in recorded history. At the same time, the Allied nations met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and established the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Suddenly, development economics became a massive formalized academic and bureaucratic industry. It was no longer just kings and prime ministers fighting over territory. It was men in sharp suits with PhDs from Harvard and Oxford running massive econometric models. Econometric models. There we go. Sorry, folks. The goal was to figure out how to take the newly decolonized, structurally impoverished nations of the global south and rapidly modernize them to prevent them from falling to Soviet influence. For about 30 years after World War II, this Keynesian consensus held. The federal government managed the macroeconomy, labor unions were strong, wages grew alongside productivity, and the American middle class experienced a golden age of wealth accumulation. But then in the 1970s and 1980s, the ground shifted again. A massive structural earthquake hit the United States. The era of globalization and hyper-financialization arrived. The massive American manufacturing monopolies that had driven the post-war boom began to face fierce, highly efficient competition from a rebuilt Japan and a rising Germany. To cut costs, American corporations began moving their supply chains offshores to Mexico and China. The American Rust Belt started to hemorrhage jobs. The steel mills closed. The auto plants downsized. Simultaneously, the political winds shifted. The federal government, under the rising ideology of neoliberalism, began to step back. They deregulated industries, cut federal revenue sharing to local municipalities, and abandoned the heavy hands-on industrial policy of the New Deal era. And in that vacuum, individual states, counties, and cities woke up to a terrifying new reality. They were completely on their own. If a town in Michigan lost its auto parts factory, the federal government was not coming to save them. If a city in Pennsylvania lost its steel mill, Washington, D.C. was not going to build them a new one. The local mayors, the county commissioners, and the regional chambers of commerce realized that if they wanted their communities to survive the brutal, unforgiving new global market, they had to fight for capital themselves. The grand macroeconomic strategies of the nation-state were suddenly downloaded directly to the local zip code. This birthed the era of what we call smokestack chasing. In the 1980s and 90s, the modern site selection and local economic development industry absolutely exploded. States began engaging in a cutthroat, zero-sum civil war with one another to land the next massive auto assembly plant, the next regional distribution hub, or the next corporate headquarters. And what tools do these local economic developers use? The exact same tools that the architects of the 1700s and 1800s used. We didn't invent anything new, we just localized the battlefield. When a modern governor or a local EDC director sits down and offers a massive 20-year property tax exemption and a highly customized public infrastructure grant to lure a semiconductor fab to their state, they are literally practicing local mercantilism. They are Jean-Baptiste Colbert trying to build a royal glass factory by manipulating state resources. When a city uses tax increment financing to capture future tax revenues to subsidize the immediate construction of a private industrial park, they are using the exact same financial logic that the federal government used when they gave away public land to finance the transcontinental railroads. When a regional economic development organization pulls together 5 squabbling counties, convinces them to drop their internal rivalries, pool their workforce data, and market themselves globally as a single unified supply chain corridor, they are building a modern regional Zovairian. And when a state legislature funnels millions of dollars into a local community college to design a custom, highly specific mechatronics and robotics curriculum exclusively for a new aerospace manufacturer, they are executing the exact human capital strategy of Otto von Bismarck and the Prussian state. You are heirs to this history. You are operating the heavy machinery of statecraft, just on a regional scale. Which brings us to the segment of the show where we look at the ultimate Nobel Prize winning lesson that ties this entire 300-year evolution together. It's time for the nerd section, and the final one. For those of you who would normally leave at this juncture, I implore you to stay. This is a pretty good one, and it really helps to wrap things up for this entire 10-part series. If you're still going to leave, then I appreciate you sticking with us through 10 full gosh darn episodes on the history of economic development. I really hope you've developed a new perspective and learned something along the way as to why we do what we do in this profession. For everybody else, and hopefully that's everybody, we'll be right back. If you open a modern university textbook on development economics today, you'll read about advanced econometrics, complex regression analyses, and a focus on poverty, human capital, and governance. Econometrics. All right. I'm sorry, that word it has really gotten me over this series. God, geez, I hate when I mispronounce something like that. But anyways, that's what a modern university textbook on development economics would say today. But the secret of modern development economics is that it is not all new. The formal 20th century field of economic development is simply the academic mathematical rediscovery of the exact same structural questions that Hamilton, Bismarck, and List were forced to answer in the 1800s. For decades, modern economists argued about whether geography, culture, or climate determined a nation's wealth. But in recent years, the field has reached a profound consensus, and this consensus was actually just awarded the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics, given to Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson. Through massive historical data analysis, they proved the most important lesson of this entire podcast series. Differences in economic institutions are the fundamental cause of differences in economic development. Differences in economic institutions are the fundamental cause of differences in economic development. An institution, after all, is just the rules of the game. It is the way a society structures incentives. If a nation is built on extractive institutions like the colonial cash crop plantations, the forced labor camps, or modern corrupt political monopolies that funnel all wealth to a tiny elite, that nation will mathematically fail to develop a prosperous middle class regardless of how many natural resources they have. If a nation builds inclusive institutions like secure property rights, patents that reward innovation, a functioning central bank, and universal public education, that nation will harness the collective genius of its population and thrive. When you, as a modern economic developer or site selector, look at a region, you are not really evaluating their marketing brochure. You are acting as an institutional auditor. Are you looking at an extractive system that relies entirely on low-wage labor and massive corporate tax giveaways that drains this public school budget? Or are you looking at an inclusive system where the local community college partners directly with advanced manufacturers, where the infrastructure is publicly maintained, and where the rule of law guarantees that a startup founder can always keep the value of their invention? The math hasn't changed. The institutions dictate the outcome. The early evolution of economic development is not a neat philosophical fairy tale about the triumph of the free market. It is the messy, contingent, heavily engineered, and often brutal history of institutional experiments. It is the story of the Zollverein erasing borders. It is the story of the Bank of England inventing the bond market. And it is the story of the Meiji bureaucracy dragging a feudal society into the industrial age. It is the story of the U.S. land grant system laying steel across a continent. It is the story of the factory inspectorate fighting for child labor laws, the colonial extractive board starving millions for profit, and Otto von Bismarck inventing health insurance to stop a revolution. If there is one absolute truth we can take away from this 300-year history, it is this. There is no one true magical path to economic development. There is no universal equation. There is only a toolkit. A toolkit of incredibly practical, mechanical, structural institutions that are and always have been forged in the absolute fires of political, social, and military conflict. And you are the ones currently holding those tools. When you lobby for a regional transit authority, when you design a customized workforce training grant, or when you fight to protect your local supply chain from an extractive enclave economy, you are carrying on the legacy of Hamilton, List, and Bismarck. You are writing the next chapter. I'm Devin Hillsdon-Smith. Thank you for listening to this massive historical journey with me. And thank you for sticking through the dirt, the steel, and the spreadsheets. Finally, thank you for listening to The Architects of Prosperity here on Site Selectors Are People Too. Keep building the future. And remember, site selectors are people too. See ya. Just a heads up, views expressed in this podcast are solely my own and are not attributable to any employers, whether past or present. Thank you.